Cattle drives. In the time after the Civil War, most of Texas was open range, or grassy unfenced plains. Cattle roamed across the open range, wandering far from their ranches. Fencing material was in short supply in Texas. Wood was scarce and stone was often hard to find too. Barbed wire, twisted wire with very sharp points or barbs, hadn't been invented yet. To keep track of the ownership of the cattle, cowboys used brands, or design burned into the hide of a cow. Each ranch had its own unique brand to identify their cattle. If you look to the right, you can see some examples of actual brands that different ranches used. They often used letters to help represent the names of their ranch. And these different symbols meant different things. So, for instance, this line at the top would be called bar. And then sometimes the letters were turned on their side, or like this one might be called hanging J. If you look right here, can you figure out what this brand is? Brands are read top to bottom, left to right. So this is Bar BQ. They must have had some pretty good beef. During the Civil War, many of the ranchers were away fighting in the battles. This left the cattle alone to breed on the open plains. Obviously, cows are not born with a brand. So that meant that hundreds and thousands of unmarked cattle, or mavericks, were just out there for the taking, kind of like free money. These mavericks could be claimed in the spring roundup when they went out and they gather up all their cattle, just by simply stamping the ranch's brand on the cattle. After the Civil War, northern cities' demand for fresh beef grew. In Texas, a cow might sell for $3 or $4, but in Chicago, it would sell for $30, and in New York, $50. Of course, the ranchers want to increase their profits by selling to these northern cities, but the problem was in figuring out how to get the cattle to the market. There was no refrigeration to keep the meat fresh, so the cattle had to be moved alive as far as possible. And you're certainly not going to be walking a couple hundred cows all the way up to New York City. You're going to run into a whole bunch of cities along the way, and there's just no way to control them in that environment. The farthest most cattle were able to be driven in the early cattle drive days was Chicago. So first they started walking them all the way to Chicago, but that was pretty long and difficult. Then there was an invention that made it a lot easier: the train, the locomotive. The major railroads were north of Texas at this time, in Kansas, Missouri, and even northwest in Wyoming. Trains were the easiest way to quickly move large numbers of live cattle. All you had to do is just put them on these train cars in the back, and there you go. You can move them as far as you want. To get the cattle to Chicago, the ranchers still had to walk them up to where the railroads were, up to Kansas or Missouri or Wyoming. So the ranchers hired drovers to take the cattle north. The man in charge of the trail was called the trail boss. He had a team of cowboys with him to help control and move the cattle. They held various positions. Some were in front of the herd, some were at the side of the herd, and then there were a few that were at the back, called the drag rider. This position was usually assigned to brand new cowboys because the dust that was kicked up by all the cattle, as you can see in this picture here, made the position pretty uncomfortable. Here are some of the cattle trails that were in use after the Civil War and up through about 1886. So you'll notice that it doesn't have dates on here of when they were used, but it went from east to west. Okay, the Goodnight Loving Trail was one of the last trails. So the Shawnee Trail was first, and that's because the train had only gotten, the railroad tracks had only been built so far as Sedalia, Missouri. So they would bring the cattle up from South Texas all the way up through Sedalia, Missouri. That was called the Shawnee Trail. There's one trail that's not listed on here called the Preston Trail that would go up right about here. And the Preston Trail actually runs just west of us through Pottsboro. If you've ever been down to the Frisco Mall, you might have noticed next to the Frisco Mall, there's a shopping center. And in the shopping center, there's a whole bunch of statues of cows. And that's commemorating Preston Trail. Why do they have it there? Because the Frisco Mall is built on Route 121, also known as Preston Road, and Preston Road is built exactly where the Preston Trail used to be. So then there's the Chisholm Trail, which went from San Antonio up through Abilene, Kansas, or Ellsworth, Kansas. And then the Western Trail, which went from Bandera, Texas, up through to Nebraska. Now, this one over here, the Goodnight Loving Trail, actually had a different idea. They said, hey, how about all the people in the West who are just moving west, the frontiersmen, the U.S. Army living in all of the forts and outposts in the area, they want meat too. So how about instead of shipping it east to Chicago and to New York City, how about if we bring the cattle west and we kind of sell off a few at a time as we're going up here west? And the hardest part of this trail was the fact that New Mexico is very dry and deserty, and you had to be just exact to find enough water to be able to keep the cows alive and moving. But these were the cattle trails that were used during this time. Life on the trail was not easy. Just an average day was a lot of hard work out in the sun and the dust, rounding up the cattle, getting them to move. It was pretty lonely too because the cowboys were all spread out. They weren't hanging out with each other. But there were a lot of dangers on the trail also. Each one of these pictures represents one of the major dangers on the cattle trails. Wildfires could move very quickly through the dry grass of the plains. They could move so quickly that they could outrun a man riding a horse at full gallop. So if you heard the crackling of a wildfire, you were going to get your horses and your cattle moving as fast as possible. Next, you'll see gopher holes. You might ask yourself, how could gopher holes possibly be a danger of the trail? I mean, gophers are cute and cuddly. What could they possibly do? Well, if a cow or a horse is not paying attention, they could step into the gopher hole and then they're going to break their leg. And if a cow or a horse breaks their leg on the trail, there's no vet that's going to be able to come and fix them up and get them back home to the ranch. So unfortunately, they usually had to shoot the cow or horse. Of course, coyotes are kind of an obvious danger. They're going to want to eat the cows or the horses, sometimes even the men. And so that's why the cowboys had to stay up at night and watch out for the cows, because often the coyotes would try to come at night and get a couple of the weaker cows that were away from the rest of the herd. Rattlesnakes. Now, of course, rattlesnakes, getting bit by a rattlesnake, that's something that's a danger in itself. But just the sound of the rattlesnake could spook your horse or spook the cattle and cause them to stampede, which means they all run at the same time. It's kind of crazy, not even paying attention where they're running. Lightning. You might ask yourself, how could lightning possibly be a danger? Well, kind of the same thing as the rattlesnakes. If there was a bad storm and lightning started to happen, one of the cows could get spooked and then start running. And because of cows' herd mentality, when one of them starts to run, the others figure, hey, there must be a predator nearby. We better run too. And so then they start to run, and pretty soon they're all running, they're stampeding, and they actually will keep on running sometimes until their hearts give out. And so whenever the cows start stampeding, what the cowboys would have to do is force them to turn around and kind of make a U-turn and circle back into the rest of the herd, so they kind of run into each other, and then that forces them to slow down and calm down. Cattle herds could be expected to travel between 15 to 20 miles per day. Cowboys had a difficult job controlling the cattle all day long. Each cowboy would have several horses that they would ride for various tasks. Slow, calm horses would be used at night to guard the sleeping cattle. Fast horses would be used to round up the loose cattle. The horses that were not being ridden would ride together in a pack called a remuda, the Spanish word for remount, and they had a special cowboy who was in charge of taking care of the horses. His name was the wrangler. Farmers did not like cattle drives because the cattle could destroy their crops and sometimes get their cattle sick. Farmers would often have a couple of milk cows, and the Texas Longhorns carried this disease called Texas fever. They didn't actually get sick themselves, but they could get other people sick with it. And so, as the Longhorns would come through, they might get the milk cows sick, and then the farmers' cows would die. And of course, often the cattle would trample the crops. And so, farmers really didn't like cattle drives. There was kind of this uh, enemy mentality between farmers and cowboys. And then a guy named Joseph Glidden invented barbed wire. Barbed wire was cheap and it was very easy to put up, and so many farmers began to fence in their land. And this prevented most cattle drives. In fact, we call that the end of the cattle drive era.